recent centuries. And I should say all of us are on this journey, the leaders included, not just the fellows themselves. So we look forward to Bruce's help and advice on our quest. Now, before Bruce begins, I should mention something else. In the last year, Bruce has experienced a major loss of hearing. I don't know what the percentage is fixed at, but it's been big. And when it's super quiet like this, it's very easy. But when the room is a little bit more, there's a little bit more noise in the room. It's more difficult for him to pick up. So I'm actually wearing a device that will relay my comments to his earpiece, and probably I'll be in the same position as we go to questions and interactions with you all, just relaying ideas. We do want to have interaction. We're going to let him get some momentum going before I ask impertinent questions and interrupt him with annoying comments. But we do want to have a dynamic, and we'll signal that to you when the time is ready. We're going to have we'll be together all day, as you saw, and over lunch. Unfortunately, at lunch, there probably will not be the opportunity to interact with him, just because of the level of noise that's going to be in the room. That's not going to. He'll be here. He'll have lunch with us, but there won't be the possibility, the level of possibility. So, Bruce, thanks so much for being with us, and yeah, we've been praying a lot for this time. Really looking forward to it. Please.
Thank you, Kelly. Thank you all for being here. You know, this past year, about almost a year ago, lost my hearing almost entirely. And when I tell people that, they almost always go, "Oh, I'm so sorry." And I say, "Don't make sympathetic noises. I can't do it." I'm muddling through, you know. I said, keep calm and muddle through. And Kelly was asking me a few moments ago, has the hearing loss affected my ability to work as a painter? And thankfully, it hasn't. There's been a huge loss, though, and that is that I've been painting for a long time, and I always listen to music when I paint. But the truth is, music all sounds like noise to me now. Everything from Bach to the Beatles sounds like punk rock, played by a bad garage band. So that's a major loss. Interestingly, and I don't know why this is, the voice of Joni Mitchell is crystal clear.
There's worse things.
Yeah. A little gift, you know, and there's something in the timbre of her voice, something in the modality and clarity of her voice that gets through this, whatever frequencies are missing in my hearing. And it was overnight, and certain frequencies of sound are just gone, subtracted entirely. So that's why music sounds like noise, because music is harmony. So I can't get harmony. But more about that a little bit later. A word about my title here, The Hint Half Guessed. I'll drop a hint here, but you're going to have to guess. Hopefully it'll come clear. So here's the hint. There's an art form in Japan called kintsugi. Maybe you've heard about it. I see some heads nodding. It's about mending broken things, but not disguising the loss. Not trying to pretend that something catastrophic has not happened. Now, that's a country, Japan, that's well familiar with catastrophe. They've been visited by tsunamis for centuries and centuries, volcanic eruptions, major catastrophic loss. And then, of course, in World War II, because of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, as we entered the atomic age, whole cities were leveled. There was no distinction between citizen and soldier. And so that the mending in kintsugi is accompanied with gold. So that a special kind of lacquer glue is used to hold the pieces together, and it's fused with pure gold. And so the fissures, the fractures are honored. The scars are not hidden. They're made beautiful. And we know something about loss and beauty as Christians, and hopefully that'll come clear. We'll have some conversation today, I hope, about this. And my broad topic is brokenness and the beautiful. However, before I get into my formal remarks, I thought it'd be nice for you to hear from a really important theologian, Calvin. Uh-oh. Something is seriously wrong here. Laws of perspective have been repealed. Objects no longer diminish in size with distance. Lines do not converge toward any point on the horizon. All spatial relationships are lost. It's impossible to judge where anything is. Oh no! Calvin, quit running around crashing into things or I'll sell you to the monkey house. And now she's lost perspective. So, just a few personal milestones I'd like to share with you that I'm quite happy about. One is that I've been with the same woman for half a century. Amazing. We were married on Niles Beach in 1973 in Gloucester. Yes, it was a hippie wedding. And I've been making art for a half a century as well. I mean, I made art from the time I was a little boy. I'm 70, but I really committed to a life work as an artist a half a century ago. And by God's grace, still making art after all that time. So I've been 40 years living with Jesus. I was 30 years old when I converted to Christian faith. I had been involved in all the stuff that hippies were involved in, and you can kind of fill in the blank there. Yes, all of it. And my wife and I had been blessed to live on the same street for 35 years. There's a saying on Walker Street, when you move in, you're not allowed to leave except in a pine box. And that's how we plan to leave. But we're still on the same street. We moved down the street and built a house. I was fortunate enough to build a house myself with my own hands. I turned 70 this year, as I said. 11 months ago, I suddenly lost my hearing overnight. Those are my milestones to share with you this morning. And I'll share this as well.
One of my earliest memories, when I was 6 years old, I remember trying to draw my grandpa and looking at my drawing and being so disappointed at how crummy the drawing was and how wonderful my grandfather's face was and how full of mystery and time and stories and feelings and all kinds of just history, human history was right there in his face, and I felt that my drawing was just a travesty. Of course, I didn't have fancy words like travesty. But it was crummy, and I hated it. My best bit of advice for a younger artist is to keep trying. Do not quit. Here I've been painting for half a century. I started when I was 18. I mean, I made art all the time as a kid, but I made the decision to be a professional artist when I was 18, and I'm now 68, so half a century. I don't want to think about my technique. Because the faithful discipline of making that will lead to those good places. As someone once said, the reason you have to show up in your studio it might actually make a work of art. There's a chance, a possibility. For me, making art is essentially an act of submission. It's an act of letting go of my illusion that I am the one in charge of my life. I have to dive in head first at the beginning of a painting, and sometimes I don't know what the heck I'm doing. In fact, what you're looking at in the walls of my studio right now are a lot of starts that might be finished paintings, but my hunch is that they may not survive. They may have to go a step further. A lot of the portraits I've done in the last 10 years started out as completely abstract paintings and ended up becoming a lifelike portrait. Oftentimes almost always start abstract, pushing paint around, shapes, colors, textures, and then I often will scrape down and repaint, and then sometimes sand through whole layers of paint before the image starts to come to me as a sense of where this thing wants to go. When I paint, I have to find my way by making. It's not like, directly taking dictation, but I do have a sense that I get little nudges in the process of where this thing is supposed to go. Meg and I were married in 1973 on Niles Beach here in Gloucester, and whoever happened to be home in our immediate neighborhood was invited. We didn't send out invitations, and we had the Justice of the Peace meet us down at the beach, and he married us there. I sang at my wedding, I think, Begin the Begin by Cole Porter with a guitar, and here's the moment of, he said, do you take her to be your wedded wife? Yeah, we were kids. She was 19, I was 20. It was a magical time for us. The reason I had come to Gloucester was because I fell in love with the light here around the ocean side. This really very particular kind of light, I think, that happens around coastal towns, and Gloucester is kind of really a special place. The face of a lion, it hasn't got a mane, it's kind of a bald lion.
You see the lion's face?
Yeah. My wife and I basically settled on this street 35 years ago. And she had also grown up moving around a lot. Her dad was the same corporate climber and moved them all over the world. She was dizzied by the moving she'd done. And we didn't really even talk about it, we just did it. We just planted ourselves. And we've been on this same street for 35 years. Over the course of the past 18 months, the COVID lockdown, where we were completely isolated, I took up walking as a form of exercise, but it quickly turned into hiking. Within 5 or 6 kilometers of our house, there are hundreds of trails that I'd never known anything about. So I was on these daily hikes, and I would discover all kinds of things like fallen leaves, roots and branches, fallen timber, trees that had fallen down in the storms that were growing lichens and different kinds of fungi, and really amazing shapes and colors. And I think that just sort of got under my skin and sort of distilled, steeped in there for a while until it came out in some of these paintings that I've done in the last year. It's recognizable as some of the kind of thing I've been doing for years, which is all the layering and the scraping and sanding and then repainting. That very same process of making that I find myself doing naturally, that kind of vigorous losing and finding a form, is exactly what happens in nature all the time. Something grows up, a branch falls off, the leaves fall, twigs are there, vines are growing, roots will emerge out of the ground as there's erosion. Those same forms that I encountered in those walks, those hikes, are re-emerging in kind of distilled, abstracted form. What I want to do is be like those who are born of the Spirit, be able to receive guidance and then submit to that jet stream, that flow, and let it take me where it wants to go. I'm a servant of the work. I don't think of myself as this grand author and grand planner of the work of art. If I planned a work of art, it would definitely be something I'd want to throw away. I really do believe that you're only an artist while you're making the art. The rest of the time, you're just like everyone else. You're a viewer of that artifact. There's no difference between you and the next person. And I really can't stand the idea of an artist going around trying to determine what other people made of their work. Kind of saying, this is what this thing means. It can't mean anything else. What a terrible idea. I love that play between abstraction on the one hand, conceptual, and the unexpected. Jesus said those who are born of the Spirit are like the wind. You neither see where it originates nor where it's going. You see the effects in the wind. And he talks about those who are born of the Spirit being like the wind. In other words, being able to move suddenly while being inspired, literally inspired to breathe in the Spirit. And what happens is the unexpected, the surprise. And that surprise is often the presence of God.
So, a former student of mine about a year ago, and he and his friend Nate Henderson, the filmmaker, Jeff Stevens is his name, came to visit me in my studio, and Jeff is one of those truth tellers who looked me in the face and said, Bruce, your website is stale, and I'm going to do something about it. And he said, I'm going to start with a film because he said, your story ought to be told. So that's, this is the ideal thing for a teacher is to be taught by your students, it seems to me. I mean, that's what you hope for. And that's what's happening to me at this point in my life. Having taught for 40 years, I'm now a student again. Well, I've never stopped being a student, truth be told, but in particular now I feel like I'm learning a tremendous amount from younger artists. And so that's what I thought today. Maybe what I do is just simply introduce you to my work and to my life a little bit, and then open it up for conversation. I made a couple of points that we could go back into, and this afternoon I have a second little brief discourse of sorts that I'd like to share with you, which will also look at some other principles that we might want to talk about. But Kelly, anything you want to start with?
Well, I'll ask a really broad question. What are you doing? What is it that you're doing? One of the things that stood out to me is this is a process of discovery. From my perspective, seeing paintings that are there and maybe they're finished, maybe they're not finished. You're not sure yet. The idea that you don't plan your work. So how would you describe positively what it is that you're doing?
Okay. Well, I mean, I'm sure there are other artists in this room, right?
Whether you're paid or unpaid, yeah.
Just because you're paid doesn't make you better. In fact, I have a funny story for you. A friend of ours who's an incredibly gifted woman was at a kind of mid-career change, and she was offered a couple of different options, and she invited Meg, my wife, and I over to visit, to have breakfast with she and her husband, and to help her sort of discern. And she laid out all these options, and you know, a lot of it did have to do with salary and whatnot. And at one point, she asked, "So, do you have any response, any thoughts, any questions?" And Meg leaned forward and said, "What makes you think you ought to get paid to do what God wants you to do?" You know, I mean, and then that sort of was a showstopper. Yeah, the sense of vocation. What are we doing? And you know, how do we receive from God our instructions as to what to do next? And that's something I think, depending on what your age is in this room, you may be at a transition point, you may be well on your way, you may be getting closer to my age where there may be a shift going on, you know, like there is for me. Not just because of my hearing disability, but because of, you know, turning 70 just seemed to be a milestone of sorts. And now I have a lot more prominent things in the rear view mirror than I think I had in recent years. What am I doing? Well, you know, I'm trying to remain faithful to this little gift that I've been aware of since I was 5 or 6 years old. I mean, there was no question in my mind as a little child that I was supposed to make art. I've been making art since I was at, I mean, every kid makes art, right? You have to almost unlearn how to be an artist because you're born an artist. You know, we're made in God's image. God is a maker, so we're makers. But I never unlearned it. But I never intended to unlearn it. I remember my dad saying to me when I was about 6 years old, "Brucey, what do you want to be when you grow up?" And I remember saying, "Dad, you know what I'm going to be when I grow up. I'm going to be an artist." And he said, "Oh, yes, of course." So when I'm 14, he asked me, "So what are you thinking, you know, you might do professionally?" I said, "Dad, you already asked me that question." So I mean, that's been my sense of vocation since I was a little kid. But being faithful to that gift, I want to just say a word about gift. So I believe that that is literal, that the capacity to make things is a gift, meaning you can't earn it. It's like grace itself and salvation itself. You can't earn it. You can build your skill set, you can build your knowledge base. There's a lot of things you can do, and you must do if you're going to be an artist of any sort, poet, composer, painter, whatever. It takes a long time to become proficient and skillful. But just because you're skillful doesn't mean you're making works of art. Because the best part of my work, I said it in a way in that little film clip there, the best part of my work I have no control over at all. It's a gift. It just comes or it doesn't. I mean, most of the paintings you saw in that film have been painted over top of at this point, including 3 very large paintings about 8 feet tall. They were part of an exhibition in Houston of my work last fall, completely painted over top of them since then. And that would be very frustrating to the people that came to that show if they liked those pieces, but I'm a servant of the work, you know. The work wanted to become something else, so I don't know if you want to go
Yeah,
into
no,
that.
that's good, that's good. And I'm going to open it up in a minute too. Yeah, go ahead, Lexi. What were you going to say?
Just following up on what you just said, how do you discern, like you're saying you're a servant of this gift, of just kind of this beautiful vision. So when you have a painting, how do you discern when it's finished or not? Like what is the signal for you, and how to use that gift and how to serve that gift?
He'll translate for me because I could only hear like 30% of what he said.
So in the process of using your gift and moving towards completion of a particular art, how do you discern when it's finished, when it's done?
Yeah, how do you discern the actual steps?
How do you discern the
to
steps
serving that gift?
towards fulfillment of a particular gift?
Well, I mean, part of the reason you have to spend a long apprenticeship, I think it was Malcolm Gladwell that said the minimum to get started is 10,000 hours. Maybe I see some people, it's in his book Outliers. That's to get started, 10,000 hours. Have you ever tried to figure out what that is? That's 40 hours a week for 5 years. So that's to get started. The reason you have to put in all that prep time is so that you can be discerning and so that you have certain kinds of methodologies that are possible that you can employ. But they may not all be appropriate. And so that's where the discernment comes in. I think if we care to take advantage of it as Christians, I don't know how many people in this room are Christians, but I am, and one of the things I've discovered by following Jesus is that he does communicate with you if you're listening. But that listening process can sometimes involve submitting to other people. I said in that film clip, art is an act of submission, making art is an act of submission, but the whole Christian life is an act of submission. And it's not just submission to God. It's submission to one another. It says that very clearly in Paul's letter to Ephesians. In chapter 5, I think it is, he says, be submissive one to another out of reverence for Christ. And he gives this list of how to be submissive after that in chapter 6. So that submission seems to me key. And so listening to other people, my wife Meg is my main critic. I was working on a body of work just a few years ago, which has come to be known as Ordinary Saints. It was a collaboration with a poet named Malcolm Geit and a composer named Jack Redford. And I'm not a portrait painter generally, although I was trained in figurative painting. But I don't usually do portraits, but these were all portraits. And Meg would come down to the studio and she would say, no, it's not there yet. And I'd say, oh. John Singer Sargent, the famous portrait artist, said, this is what a portrait is. It's a picture of something, of someone, where there's something wrong with the mouth. That's a portrait. And boy, is he right. Yeah.
There's another question over here.
Well, I was just going to add, to that question, of you were done with those things that you put in the art exhibit, but then you changed it. So I was just wondering, what's the mindset of, something's done, you come to that point of completion, but then you actually have this reversal, and then even after having it in an exhibit, you're like, I'm going to change it.
I heard that okay. Yeah. Thank you for projecting your voice. Yeah. Well, this reminds me of a funny story. Pablo Picasso, you've all heard of Picasso, right? Kind of probably the most famous artist of the 20th century. Whenever he would go to the Prado, he would be met with guards. And it's because he had taken a painting off the wall of his and taken it out of the museum to work on it again. It was never safe to let him look at his own work in a museum. Yeah. I'm not sure how to respond entirely, except that just because a painting has a frame on it, doesn't mean that it's going to be well behaved. It might need to be undone. It may need to be reworked. But I'll just tell you, if you ever buy a painting of mine, I promise I won't come and change it. Actually, I'd get in a lot of trouble if I started doing it.
That would be problematic. You said that what you're doing is trying to be faithful to your gift, if I can summarize it that way. You became a Christian as an adult. This gift you received as a child, and in the Fellows Program and in Christian teaching generally, we have this understanding of two major sorts of calling. A sort of general calling, we're called to Christ, we're called to God, we're called to redemption, we're called to glory. But that comes, the Apostle Paul says, in the context of a specific and particular gift that happens to constitute all these other callings that you have, this background. How did your particular calling in Christ change your sense of this general calling? How did it refine it? What did you say about the difference that it made for you to be called to Christ on your particular calling as an artist?
It's an excellent, challenging question. Well, as a little kid, maybe you can relate to this, folks. As a little kid, I had a very strong sense of God's presence. And I think I most often felt God's presence in simple things like light and color and, you know, the difference between night and day, those sensory encounters with the numinous, transcendent quality of reality itself, right? So I was a very religious kid in that regard. In fact, my artistic sensibility, I'm sure, is the same thing as my faith sensibility. I mean, they were deeply interwoven. But in terms of my adult confession of faith in Christ, I mean, I always loved Jesus from the first time I heard about him as a little kid. But I wasn't a disciple. I didn't become a disciple of Jesus until I was 30 years old. And I thought when I had a budding art career in my 20s here in Boston and had several major exhibitions and got written up in the Boston Globe and got a lot of attention as a young artist and started having collectors buy my work here in Boston. And Meg really did not want to be part of that world, which involved going to dinners and parties and meeting with collectors and art openings, and she just, I'll say it simply, she has a pretentiousness meter and a hair trigger. So, and she was triggered all the time at those art events. And that was right around the time that I ended up coming to really commit my life to Christ, to a life of discipleship. And at first she said, I don't want anything to do with this Jesus freak. But then she said she saw a change in me over the course of that first year. Made her agree to try going to church with me. We ended up at a little church in Gloucester called Lanesville. And the senior minister there was Gordon Hugenberger. So he was our teacher for about a dozen years, and he was also our marriage counselor. But I got this idea that I couldn't be an artist and follow Jesus, because my art was so wrapped up with my ego and with my, career. And so I was thinking, I'm going to give this up. So I enrolled in an MDiv program at Gordon Commonwealth Theological Seminary. And Meg, she went along with that, but she didn't think anything of it. It's just Bruce being a student again. He's always a student. He's always learning something. And then one night there was this couples night at the seminary, and it was being led by my church history professor, Nigel Kerr. And he stood up in the front of the room and he said, all those among the married couples in this room, please stand up who are planning to go into full-time ministry. And so I stood up, and Meg tugged on my shirt and said, sit down. And then the couple in front of us turned around, and she said, you may think you're called to be a minister. I was thinking I'd become a priest, because I grew up Episcopal, and I thought I was going to become an Episcopal priest. She said, you may think you're called to be a priest. I'm not called to be a priest's wife. So I doubt that you're called to be a priest. And then she said this thing, which she had the most to lose. She said, you are an artist. I put you through art school. You're supposed to make art. And it was like listening to the voice of God. And I often find that her voice is the voice of God. Sorry, another funny story. So I was a taxi driver early on in our marriage, and she says it ruined my driving forever. And one time we were on our way up to Dartmouth to visit our son, and we're driving down the highway, and I'm exceeding the speed limit once again. She says, please slow down. I said, oh, yeah, okay. 10 minutes later, please slow down, because I'd sped up again. Third time. And I said, oh, yeah, I will. Cop car. Pull over, license and registration, please. He takes it, goes back to his car to do his background check, which they do. Comes back, hands me the registration, and we're silent in the car. Handed me my license registration. He says, he leans into the car and says, Professor Herman, just slow down. And he said, I'm not going to give you a ticket. Rolled up the window, we're driving along, completely silent for 10 minutes. And I said out loud, I sent you a perfectly good wife, but you wouldn't listen, so I had to send you a cop. You know? And Meg went, yeah, so the voice of God.
Beauty is a controversial topic, to say the least. Are you making beauty?
Well, you know, the reason I started with that image of the kintsugi bowl with its beautiful golden fissures and fractures is because the only kind of beauty that I think it can be honestly made in a broken world is broken beauty. And I mean, I think people try to make beauty in lots of different ways, but a lot of times they falsify. They have to falsify the reality of their life in order to do so. And I don't think that's acceptable to our God, who has himself allowed himself to be broken on our behalf. And so, for me, the starting point of genuine beauty is the cross. It's the ultimate kintsugi. Yeah. Yeah, so that's, I mean, this afternoon I have another little presentation to make, a little more about this concept of broken beauty. I'm going to leave it there. If there are other questions, yeah, we can.
Trying to make it as open as possible to you guys and get you involved. I can keep talking all the time, but yeah, go Colin.
You talked about a difference between someone who's just skilled and can maybe put paint on a canvas and a work of art. Can you speak to what the qualitative difference is? How can you tell a work of art from, you know, someone who just was skilled with paint?
Thank you. I heard that, Colin. I also heard your name. You know, Colin, one of the first things that anyone asks me about a painting is, how long did it take you to make this? And my answer these days is 50 years. But that's the skill side of the equation, which is, it does take a long time, a long apprenticeship. It's, what is it, a long obedience in the same direction? Yeah. But where does the art element come from? I really believe it is akin to the movement of the Spirit. I mean, Jesus said, those who are born of the Spirit are like the wind. You don't know where it comes from, or you can't even really tell where it's going. You just see the effects, the kind of churning. And I think a really good artist is someone who has figured out how to get herself out of the way. And it takes a lot of skill, a lot of knowledge to get to the point where you can let go. I mean, Rembrandt, who's undeniably one of the greatest artists in the European tradition, once said, I've spent all these years and all this effort attempting to attain a sense of effortlessness. And so the whole point of acquiring technique is so that you can forget it. Let it go. And Picasso, a little more cleverly, said, I spent 4 years trying to learn to draw like the masters, but I've spent the rest of my life trying to learn to draw like a child. And of course, what he's talking about there is the vitality of child's art. Children's art is unself-conscious, it's honest, it's immediate. And there's an energy there, a pulse of authenticity and vitality there that every artist longs for. But you can't conjure that up, you can't force it. So just because you're skillful, no guarantees. And so every time you stand in front of a canvas or a blank piece of staff paper, if you're a composer, or the blank sheet in your typewriter or under your pen or your computer, actually, no matter how skillful you are, you're kind of back to ground zero. Every time you start. The thing I'm most terrified of as an artist is cranking out Bruce Hermans.
What does that mean?
What's that?
What does that mean, cranking
Well, I
up
mean-
Bruce Herman?
Well, I mean, Bruce Herman originals, you know? Look,
Oh, I see.
like being known for a certain thing. And because, I mean, one of the things if you study the creation, and especially if you study human faces, or the face of anything, actually, one thing you learn about the creative aspects of God's way of working is that God never repeats himself. No two sunrises are the same. No two human faces are the same. Identical twins are more similar, but they're not even close to identical. So how do you do that? That's the $64 million question, you know. And so the truth is, Colin, I'm talking around your question. I don't really know the answer. I just show up.
Is there a way that we, as a person who would receive art, be able to distinguish that, or is that again not something we really have control over?
I think people do know when they stand in front of an authentic work of art. I do think you need to learn the language of different art forms. That helps. There's some work involved on the part of the viewer. I mean, for example, if you don't know anything about Chinese scroll painting, you might stand in front of one and go, well, that's nice, but you'd miss all the subtleties, right? But if you could spend 25 years studying Chinese scroll paintings, and you'd still be learning after 25 years. You might be still learning after 50 years because there's so much subtlety there.
And this is true in every discipline, every profession, every aspect of life, but there's a relationship between the tradition that has gone before and the skills, and then the ability to take what has gone before and move it a little bit forward. Talk about that, because I think today one of the biggest misconceptions in the popular imagination is the idea that you can throw out convention and tradition and start immediately.
Yeah. Well, that's excellent, Kelly. There's an essay which I highly recommend. It's not the most readable thing you'll ever come across, but I highly recommend this essay by the German philosopher Hans-Georg Gadamer. It's called The Relevance of the Beautiful. It's actually more readable than most of his philosophy, but it's heavy sledding, to be sure. But he breaks this essay up into 3 sections: symbol, play, and festival. But in the course of his essay, he says this thing about tradition, which is really wonderful. He says, tradition is not so much a matter of conservation as it is of transmission.
Tradition literally means to hand down.
Right. So tradition is less about conserving, or, it's not a conservative impulse that makes you want to honor a tradition. It's actually something a lot more complex and nuanced than that. So he said, I'll finish the quote. He says, tradition is not so much about conservation as it is about transmission. And every act of transmission is necessarily also an act of translation. Every act of transmission of the tradition is also necessarily an act of translation. So you can't just simply reproduce what was done 100 years ago. And there are people trying to do that right now in reaction to modernism and some of the excesses of modern art, modern and contemporary art. But the truly traditional artist is not trying to replicate what was done before, like a fly caught in amber. You know what has to happen to that fly if it gets caught in the amber, right? It dies. So the conservative impulse is actually something that is anti-traditional, in the true sense of the word tradition, at least as Gadamer says it. And I agree with Gadamer, obviously, that's why I'm quoting him. But I love this idea that every act of transmission is also an act of translation. That it takes And anyone who's tried to translate from, I mean, literally translate from one language to another, you know that something gets lost in translation, especially poetry. In fact, many poets believe translating poetry is impossible. You have to write a new poem. Because poetry is uniquely embedded in language. Yeah, so that's my starting point for tradition, is that the truly traditional is also the truly new. Oh, another great essay is Tradition and the Individual Talent by T.S. Eliot. And Eliot's main point in that essay, Tradition and the Individual Talent, is that you can't make anything actually new until you have internalized the tradition. If you're obsessed with novelty, you just produce these superficial, empty works that are just, they'll be new for a few minutes. And once they're not new, they're not new. But something that's truly traditional, embedded in the tradition, internalizing the tradition, but is actually new, he says, recontextualizes everything in the tradition. So once you produce an authentically new work of art, which comes out of having internalized that tradition, the tradition is changed forever. That's the way a living thing operates, right? You're never the same person who left the station when you get to the terminus. You're always changing. Change is a constant. Yeah.
To translate is to interpret, to transmit is to interpret and mean something different. There's a French expression, traduire, c'est trahir. To translate is to betray, and there's always a sense in which you cannot translate exactly what's gone before, because you're saying, even if it's in the same, you're in a new context, you're in a new place.
Yeah, I mean, even if you're not translating from English poetry, say, into Japanese poetry or, French poetry, even if you're just trying to revisit some of the things that John Milton or William Blake or Shakespeare or Auden or Eliot, if you're trying to revisit some of those same concerns in your poem, you have to write a new poem, right? You can't just simply duplicate what Eliot has done. Actually, no one would want to duplicate what Eliot has done. You know Eliot's poetry. Yeah.
Serving the work. That's Dorothy Sayers, probably the most famous person who expressed it in that sort of way. An artist herself, a writer. Talk more about that idea of serving the work, and she especially sets it over against the idea of serving the community. You're trying not to serve the needs of the community so much as to follow where the work takes you. Can you say more about that?
It's interesting. It's been a long time since I have read Sayers. If that's an accurate transmission of Sayers, I disagree with her.
Okay.
If one can do that.
Yeah.
I actually believe that the way to serve the community is to serve the work. That the work is not for the artist, it's through the artist, for the community. So to serve the work is to serve the community. But the community doesn't always know what it needs. That's the problem, Yes, sir.
If you make the community the object, then that makes the art an instrument rather than a thing of intrinsic value.
Did you say
If you serve the community as your first order of priority, that makes the art instrumental rather than an end with inherent value of its own.
Excellent point. Yeah. Actually, I mean that's a variation of what I was trying to say there about the community not knowing what it needs. Jesus is the ultimate artist. Through him all things were made. and in him all things hold together. But he didn't always tell people what they wanted to hear. Those stories, whew, they're blazingly hot sometimes, and very hard to handle. You know, actually, I love the fact that the word in the Gospel of John, the first chapter, it says, the light shines in the darkness, and darkness has not, what? It gets translated, overcome it,
Understood.
comprehended it. And the word to comprehend is to get your hands around, to handle. My translation is the light shined in the darkness, and the darkness couldn't handle it. Just couldn't handle it. And I think that's the way Jesus was hard to handle. That's why he got in so much trouble. That's why they executed him. So I think artists, if they're going to be honest and serve the work, you don't want to intentionally irritate people. But if by serving the work faithfully, you are on the outs with some community with whom you have a committed relationship, you may have to deal with that. You know, you may have to deal with the fact that it's not going to be always pretty. Back to the word beautiful, I think the beautiful is a much bigger thing than what's pretty, you know.
And beauty in those that have talked about truth, goodness, and beauty is, I forgot what the theological term is, you can, beauty is to some degree interchangeable with truth. It can be, Nathan, can you help me out with this? I'm sorry if I'm, what, truth, goodness, and beauty, what's Aquinas' word there?
I don't know, they're talking about the transcendentals.
Yeah, and the one becomes the other, or if you
Convertible.
Convertible, that's the word I'm looking for. True, to some extent, beauty is convertible as truth. What are you trying to tell the truth, and what does that mean for you?
Well, you know, Keats in his Ode on a Grecian Urn says, beauty is truth, truth is beauty, that's all you need to know on earth. And, you know, if you really believe that truth, goodness, and beauty are interwoven such that they can't be teased apart, and that they're somehow integral with the being of the Creator, our Creator God, you know, Jesus says God alone is good, and the Spirit is referred to as the Spirit of truth. That leaves beauty. And actually, I believe that Christ is the incarnation of beauty, the ultimate form of beauty, which is the beauty of godliness, the beauty of love, the beauty of forgiveness, the beauty of grace, the beauty of, you know, all those deep spiritual principles, but also the beauty of the creation. Through him, all things were made. You know, and one of the things you learn as an art student is that every portrait is also always a self-portrait. You can't help it. Everything you make has your touch, and we are made in the image of God. We are in some ways little self-portraits, but Jesus is the perfect self-portrait of God. So I think just as the Trinity, three-persons God, Milton calls our Lord, just as the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit are one, but also distinguishable, you know, goodness, truth, and beauty are one, but also distinct. It's a great mystery. I mean, as a painter, one of the things that sort of struck me as a kid that just blew my mind is that there are only three colors in the entire cosmos. You know what they are? Blue, red, and yellow, right? All of the colors are mixed from those colors. That still blows my mind. Yes, sir.
So I love
Beauty that have been promoted over the ages. You can go back and look at it. If you pick an art history class, you'll see some things were thought beautiful that now we look at and say, not so much. And I'm sure 100 years from now, people are going to look at our architecture and go, ew. You know, or maybe they'll go, wow, I wish we could make that kind of stuff. I kind of doubt it, but they might. Do you know much about architecture? Well, I mean, one of the things that you may already know this, but one of the things I find fascinating is that early in the 20th century, it was only a handful of architects who came up with this idea that we wanted to strip our architecture of all references to nature. No vines and tendrils. And so it was all the grid, the mathematical grid. The glass is still, and it allowed you to go vertical. You know, you go way beyond the usual 10 stories to hundreds of stories. But the jury is still out, from my point of view, on whether or not any of those buildings are beautiful. But that's a culturally conditioned discussion of aesthetics. In terms of beauty itself, I think it's, like I said, it's intersubjective. It's the I and thou. It's that space between the receptivity of beauty and the address of the beautiful to the receiver. That it's the coming together. It's a relationship.
Thank you.
Yeah.
I'm curious about your thoughts about the work that you do with art, as well as worshiping the Lord, and how that concept plays into the work that you do in making art, and how you perceive that, if you do, as like worship.
Thank you. You know, there's the old word for worship is liturgy, right? But that word literally translated as work. That's what the word liturgy means. It's the work of the people. And so my work is to make art. And that's how I worship God. On the other hand, another funny story. I'm full of crazy stories. So I don't know if anybody here has read any of Tom Howard's books. He wrote Christ the Tiger and a whole bunch of other books, but he's kind of infamous in the evangelical circles because he became Roman Catholic. And I met him when I first started teaching at Gordon College in 1984. He was there for one more year, and then he became Roman Catholic, and they invited him to leave. But Tom came to an exhibition of mine once, and he got there before I did. And it was this particular exhibition was all about Good Friday. So they were. You can look on my website and find them. Probably it's called. This series was called Golgotha, and one of them was a crowning. It was a very large pastel painting of close-up of the face of Christ in the crown of thorns, and these hands kind of twisting the thorns onto his head. And I walked, and Tom was standing in front of that painting, and I walked up behind him. I was going to surprise him, but he turned around, and he had been crying, and in front of this painting, and he said, "Bruce, what did you feel when you were making this?" And I said, "Tom, I don't know if you want to know the answer to that." I said, I do want to know. I said, "Okay, I'll tell you. This is what I was feeling. Needs a little more green right about here." And I mean, the truth is, when you're in the work and you're submerged in the process, you're not feeling necessarily worshipful, but that is your worship of God. I mean, you're the flower being a flower. You know, you're the wolf being a wolf. Yes, sir.
So let me try and encapsulate all my thoughts here. But so preface to this is that so I was a theater major at Gordon, actually. So I spent a lot of time in
That's why it looks so familiar.
Yeah. And so Norm Jones, the chair of the theater department, has kind of been my mentor for a few years. And I wanted to touch back on kind of your thoughts, your comments about the community and how it apprehends and receives beauty. And something Norm was always fond of saying was that, you shall know the truth and the truth shall make you uncomfortable, right? Something he also would sometimes say is that there's a quote he loves, which is, it's not his quote, but it's words should disturb, delight, and provoke the hearer, not merely make sense. And I'm curious what your experience has been in that interaction with the community in the church specifically, in how the church at large has received the arts in general, but visual art specifically, like the kind you make, and what your experience has been in the friction that is often experienced in how the church community sometimes perceives what is beautiful or what beauty ought to be, especially when it comes to things that are truthful but are uncomfortable or are challenging or disturbing. Yeah.
Tell me your name again.
Drew.
Drew. Yeah, that's a lot there. I think sadly, avant-gardism as an epiphenomenon in the arts, theater, music, etc. Avant-gardism has its own sort of issues that need to be thought through. You know the term avant-garde is a military term, right? Shock troops. And so the shock art, the idea of artists should push the envelope, always be pushing the envelope, and actually deliberately offending the bourgeoisie. This was a sacred duty of the artist in the early 20th century, was to offend and shock. But I think that that's misguided. I think it's, sometimes it's inevitable that the truth will make you uncomfortable, and that genuine beauty will shake loose your preconceptions about what's pretty. But I don't think artists should deliberately set out to try to offend or just simply shock people. I think it's silly. That's like the pursuit of novelty. It's the same kind of shallow, hollow kind of thing. But I mean, one of my favorite novelists, Flannery O'Connor, wrote stories that were frankly shocking. And she in one of her essays, I've forgotten which one, I think it's in A Good Writer is Hard to Find, play off of A Good Man is Hard to Find. She said, if you live among and work among people who share your values, you can talk with them normally. But if you live in a culture that's grown deaf to those values, or blind to those values, you learn to shout or draw with large, startling figures. And so that's what she was doing. She saw herself as living and writing among people who are morally blind, morally deaf. And so she wrote shockingly, startling stories. And I think there's room for that. But I don't think it's a sacred duty of the artist to cause trouble. I just think it's sort of inevitable sometimes. Avant-gardism as a kind of a pattern is, for me, has become threadbare and tiresome. I just don't like it. I don't like the idea that art should be somehow part of a militaristic kind of aggressive assault. There's no particular virtue in that. On the other hand, if the work leads you into places where you have to draw with those large, startling figures, or raise your voice, you raise your voice, right?
There's another hand.
Yes?
Excuse me.
Go ahead, Andy.
I'm not totally sure what my question is, but I'm hoping you can riff on whatever.
Think out loud, that's
whatever
what I
I
do.
say. But you started this gathering today, it seemed to me, delighting in how long your marriage has been and how long you've lived on the same street and how devoted you are to this part of the world and even the light of Gloucester in particular. And then you also talked about a passage of scripture that I also have spent a lot of time with and wondered about, and that's about the Spirit kind of leading people and work into surprising new places.
Mm-hmm.
And I guess I see in myself and many other artists a kind of restlessness, and especially as a Christian, trying to understand that as it relates to the Holy Spirit. And yet, you began today really delighting in a kind of steadiness in your life of place and relationships and work even at Gordon. And I just want to hear you talk about those two things.
Sure, thank you. Anna, right?
Yes.
Yeah. Henri Matisse once said his advice for younger artists was twofold. He said, always be true to the gift that you've carried with you since your youth. And then the other bit of advice is kind of surprising. He said, don't waste any of your energy cutting a figure in society. Save it for the studio. Be bourgeois. Blend in. So, you know, it's the idea of the artist as this unique creature. He said, nah, waste of time. Save it for the studio. So I've pretty much taken that advice. I am a faithful husband and father and grandfather, you know, and I'm a faithful churchman and kind of boring in the eyes of the art world probably, especially since I believe the stuff that they all find, I shouldn't say they all, but most of the art world finds frankly unbelievable. There was a museum director who used to run the Rose Art Museum at Brandeis. He was interested in my work. This is back in my late 20s. And he included me in a show at the museum. And he said, Bruce, I want to follow your work. Keep in touch with me because I'd like to maybe give you a solo exhibit here someday. I was thrilled, honored. And then about a year later, I converted to Christian faith. And I sort of dropped off of the Boston art map. We left Boston. We were living in Dorchester at the time. We moved back up to Gloucester. I took a job, up there in St. Meg, and ended up at Gordon within a short time after that, about less than 2 years after that. And I sort of forgot about Carl Bells, the director of the Rose Art Museum, but then I suddenly dawned, I should of the Golgotha paintings, and he wrote me a 2-page letter back in which he excoriated me. He said, his opening line was, Herman, you are a good painter. You have committed intellectual suicide. And I'll just say what he said. Pardon my French. He said, no one believes this shit anymore. You paint as though you actually mean this stuff. This religious stuff. Then he went on for, a page and a half after that, basically telling me I was out of my mind. And this was anachronistic, blah, blah, blah. So I wrote back I said, Dear Carl, thank you for being honest with me. This is a rare gift. I hope you live long enough to eat your words. And then I invited him to come to my next exhibition, and he said, well, I'll only come if you'll come get me. So I drove down to Brandeis, got him in the car, and drove him to the exhibition. And he spent to his credit, he spent the whole evening at this opening reception, and he studied the work carefully, and a lot of it was the Golgotha paintings and a few others. And then on the way back to his car at Brandeis, we were driving along, he says, you're still a really good painter, Herman, and this stuff is still nuts. He wasn't convinced. And so I just, you deal with it. But it hasn't stopped me. Unfortunately, he didn't live long enough to eat his words. He's passed away. He's probably eating his words now. And I like to think that our Lord has a sense of humor with folks like Carl, Because Carl would get there and face him and say, oh, it was true? Ouch. Anyway.
I don't know your name, I'm sorry.
Hi, Laura. My question goes back a little bit to what you were saying about avant-garde-ism, and I had to write down my question because I was going to forget it. So I was thinking about what you were saying about serving the work versus serving the community, and
Well, actually, Laura, I'm not saying that there is a versus there.
Sure.
I'm saying serving the work is serving the community.
Is serving the community, right? But I think it was the gentleman in front of me who was saying that if you're primarily focusing on the community and not the work,
Right.
then the work becomes an instrument rather than something unto itself.
Right, and the community gets starved out from the thing that they need.
Right. So, and it seems like both with avant-gardism and also a lot of times in the Christian art world, ironically, both tend towards using art as an instrument, like thinking so much about the community and not about the work itself. And you know, with an aim to shock or with an aim to convert or with whatever your agenda might be. But then you also brought up the Flannery O'Connor quote about you know, drawing startling images.
Yeah.
So clearly she has an eye to her audience there. So how do you reconcile that of serving the work, but still having an eye to your audience, to your reader or your viewer or whatever, without becoming sort of obsessively like, you know, like you're not even looking at what you're like looking at the audience, you're not looking at what you're painting, you know what I mean? Like,
Or worse, they're looking over your shoulder all the time.
Yeah.
Yeah, excellent. I think it's a challenge. It's really challenging, frankly. But I think, Gain, you made an excellent point, which is that if you are obsessed with,
I was just elaborating your point, okay?
what's that?
I was just piggybacking off of your point.
Yeah, but I mean, the point of being obsessed with the community and what they might think of your work, it's less that you're really serving the community and you're more concerned about what they think of you or what they think of the work. That's the problem, is you can't be overly concerned about what people think of you. One, you know, Jesus was really clear about that one. He said, you know, how can you seek honor from men and also expect honor from God? These things are mutually exclusive. I think, yeah, I don't know if I'm making that clear, and I'm thinking it as I'm saying it, so I'm not that clear on it, to be honest with you. I think it's challenging, that space between being aware that the work is demanding something of you, that may move you in a direction that's going to displease someone, and you have to be willing to go where it's going. I mean, for example, these three large paintings that I was telling you, they were in this exhibition in Houston last September, that when they came back, I just had this urge to paint over top of them. They hadn't sold, so it was safe, but they just didn't seem right. They seemed half-baked to me. Yeah, mediocre. And I actually have been saying for years to my students, you have to be willing to sacrifice the entire project in search of something excellent. In other words, it might be a total failure. And that's more desirable. Total failure is more desirable than a mediocre solution. Because if you're satisfied with something that you know isn't the best that you can do, you haven't given it your best. Period. End of story. And I actually believe that a work of art is something you can only do with all that you have, all your intellect, all your emotional and moral integrity, all your imagination, all your skill. Yeah.
Felicia.
I'm Felicia. I have a follow-up question about what you just said. As someone who's like, I call myself a recovering perfectionist, how do you think about like not being satisfied with a mediocre solution, but still, you know, you mentioned building skill and your art, I guess your art, like the ability to have the Holy Spirit work in and through you as you're making art, like building that over time, and I'm sure with a lot of repetition. So I guess like how do you hold together the desire to strive for something really excellent and then not get caught up in like, not get stuck in that at the same time?
Yeah. Thank you so much, because this is something I didn't say clearly, and I want to say it as clearly as I possibly can. Perfectionism is, it's actually idolatry. It's not true excellence. It's actually a form of idolatry. Excellence, true excellence in the arts requires a sort of a willingness to hold things lightly at the same time that you're giving it all that you've got. Perfectionism is a clinging and a kind of control mad all the dials and levers, you have to be in control. You're playing God if you're a perfectionist. And actually, I came to the conclusion at one point in my life that perfectionism is a form of self-hatred. You can't accept the fact that you're broken. You can't accept the fact that you're not, complete. And yet, I think the yearning for something beautiful should require of you real sacrifices. So there's a difference between sacrifice and perfectionism, sacrifice and idolatry. In fact, in some ways, they're polar opposites because sacrifice grows out of humility, where you realize there's something drastically wrong with you that needs to be made right, and you can't do anything about it. And so you come before God broken, and you lay down your life. Your life becomes the living sacrifice. I don't know that I can say a whole lot more about that, but thank you. I mean, that seems like a really central issue. Did that get at anything you were?
Yeah, because to be willing to walk confidently towards total failure also requires letting go of that perfectionism. And I guess I'm hearing also I guess I'm just thinking about, I'm trying to understand how something that helps me is thinking good enough is better than not done. Done is better than not done. But I know that's not I know it's not the ultimate picture of what I'm trying to I'm struggling to articulate. I know it can be better, but this is it's maybe the excellence is in the not just in the product, but it's in the heart posture and the vision of what this can be someday with more repetitions as I think about a work.
I didn't get everything that you said, but I did hear you use a really interesting phrase, good enough is better than not done. Did you say that, or did I hear that wrong?
That's basically what
Yeah,
you said.
basically.
You want to modify that? Go ahead.
Yeah, because you were talking about mediocre solution being worse than total failure, and I'm trying to fit that in with an idea of
I just thought of something, and it sort of encapsulates part of the principle you're trying to get at. G.K. Chesterton said, if a thing's worth doing, it's worth doing badly. He's clever. But I think what he was trying to say there is, it's kind of nothing ventured, nothing accomplished. So you have to be willing to try, even if it's not great. And so I guess I don't know if I'm addressing your issue, but I think this is really critical that people not be too hard on themselves. You give it all that you can, but then at some point you have to let go. You say, I'm not God. I'm not in control of this. That's why I'm trying to say the best part of my work as a painter is outside of my control. There's a lot that's under my control, because I've spent 50 years acquiring all this knowledge and skill, right? So I know I'm a master craftsman. I know that. I don't have any embarrassment to say that. But just because I'm a master craftsman doesn't mean I can make a work of art. That's the frustrating thing, because that's outside of my control.
It seems that one key idea here is simply producing. To set yourself a standard of producing a certain quantity and continuing to produce. No?
Keep going.
Well, you've talked about redoing art, painting over art, continuing to modify and progressively, but you are prolific as well. And it seems to me that part of what it means to serve the work is to do a lot of work, is to demand of yourself a lot of work. Not just working at it, but actually at least provisionally finishing what you've done and continually setting a high standard, both of excellence but also of production.
Yeah, I mean, the simplest response to that is you can't, if you don't show up in your studio and inspiration does come, you're not there when the inspiration comes. I mean, if you thought of it, I mean, that may sound bizarre to put it that way, like inspiration is some spirit that shows up
I think it's,
and you're absent.
Picasso would say inspiration has to find you working.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah, so you have to be productive. I mean, there's no two ways about it. You have to be familiar with your studio. You have to be there all the time. And I think I actually envy amateur artists on a certain level because they don't feel the compunction that they have to show up all the time. They just do it for recreational reasons or they do it for enjoyment. And I think that's wonderful. I wholeheartedly endorse, playing music for fun and making art for fun. That's not what I do. I have fun doing it sometimes, but a lot of the time I'm just aware. I joke. My saying with my family is the other day. I should tell you, my daughter and her husband and my grandson Tristan, who's now 6, moved in with us 3 years ago. So we all live in the same house, the extended family, because of the COVID nightmare in New York City drove them out and they came and lived with us. But the other day I was going down to the studio and my code with Meg is I'm heading down to the salt mines. And Tristan said, "What are the salt mines?" And Meg said, "Oh, that's where Opa goes to work." So in other words, we both know that going down to the studio is like, some days it's fluid, but more often than not, it's like breaking rocks, Yes, sir.
Can I ask a follow-on question? You said twice, and it stuck out to me both times, you gotta give it your all. Like, you gotta hold it loosely while giving it your all, or do your best.
You said that you have to give it your all, hold it loosely, but give it your all.
Yeah.
So there's a good question on that.
So what does it mean to give your all while avoiding making it an idol? Because I think that there are a lot of people and a lot of people who would feel that in order to give it my all, I have to make it my everything. So what does that...
So I ruined my marriage, I screwed up my children's life, I steal money from people to do it. I hear that. I mean, there's a lot of wreckage in artists' lives. There's no wreckage in my life. And that's thanks be to God, no thanks to me. So I think Christians have this huge advantage as artists if we're willing to take it on, which is we do not serve ourselves. We're not here to make a name for ourselves. We're here simply to serve God. You probably know this, but I love telling the story that the phrase "to make a name for yourself" comes from the story of the Tower of Babel. I don't think I have to say anything more there. If your reason for making your art is to make a name for yourself, you've just aligned yourself with the worst architects in human history. They were making a skyscraper, but it didn't go anywhere. They ended up speaking gibberish to each other. I'm gonna have to take a bathroom break.
Oh, absolutely. Let's take a break. Grab some coffee, guys, and
as a kind of a general rubric for our discussion today, this idea that beauty in a broken world is necessarily a broken beauty. And that it's actually through this convenient practice of kintsugi to show that the breakage is actually the occasion of grace. It's the occasion of beauty breaking through, as it were. As the vessel is broken, what is revealed in that breaking is actually beauty itself. Is communicated through the breaking. And the ultimate eucatastrophe, to use a more literary term, is the cross. Because in the cross, we see the love of the Father, the love of the Son, and the love of the Holy Spirit perfected. Jesus says, greater love hath no one than they lay down their life for their friends. And God has declared us God's friends. This is almost unimaginable that the creator of the entire cosmos would invite us into a friendship relationship. We're no longer called slaves or even students, disciples. We're really friends. We're invited into intimate fellowship with God. But it's only through the cross that that can happen. So something has to break. You know, Jesus says, this is my body broken, given for you. This is my blood. There's a deliberate equation of that invitation to his table, and his divine hospitality only happens because of sacrifice. He is the Paschal Lamb. T.S. Eliot says, for most of us, there is only the unattended moment, the moment in and out of time, the distraction fit lost in a shaft of sunlight, the wild time unseen, or the winter lightning, or the waterfall, or music heard so deeply that it is not heard at all. But you are the music while the music lasts. These are only hints and guesses. Hints, followed by guesses. And the rest is prayer, observance, discipline, thought, and action. The hint, half guessed, the gift, half understood, is incarnation. There's a lot there in this fragment of one of the four quartets. I won't try to unpack it. Receive it just as the music that it is. But maybe we'll spend a little time dwelling or letting the words, the hint half guessed, the gift half understood is incarnation. Let that hang in the air for a little while. So it's really, for today, for our conversation, it's hints and guesses about being broken. You know, I mentioned that I've lived at the same address, or on the same street anyway, for 35 years. And had the incredible good fortune and blessing to be able to build my own house with my own hands. But I had to build my house twice. 25 years ago, my house and studio were struck by lightning and burned down. All of the work, all of my undergraduate paintings, all of my high school work, all my undergraduate and graduate work, almost an entire decade beyond grad school of my work was incinerated in a few moments. Because the lightning that came out of a blue sky, by the way, you heard of the bolt out of the blue? It's not just a saying. It actually happened. There was a storm up the coast about 7 or 8 miles in southern New Hampshire. Blue skies overhead in Gloucester. That lightning really wanted my house. We had these, do you know what a bull pine is? It's a white pine with more than one trunk. There were 3 of them, and they were standing on the high point of our property, and each one of them had 3 trunks going up. So these 3 threesomes up on the highest point of our property were connected with 3 bolts of lightning, which split them down the middle, cooked their insides, and then dug trenches through the dirt, because the reason those trees were sitting up on the high point is because there was about that much subsoil. It's all granite ledge. So the lightning followed the root systems of these 3 giant trees, and afterwards you could see the trenches dug through the dirt. The deepest and the biggest trench went from one of the tallest of those bull pines into our basement window, and later we reconstructed it. It unwelded the fuel tank, our oil tank, at both ends, and lit the fuel. That's why the firemen couldn't put out the fire. This was a decisive act of God. That's what they call it in the insurance business. We didn't do it. It's his fault. But no. So that was pretty catastrophic. Here's another bit of Eliot for you. The dove descending breaks the air with flame of incandescent terror, of which the tongues declare the one discharged from sin and error, the only hope, or else despair, lies in choice of pyre or pyre, to be redeemed from fire by fire. This is from the last of the four quartets, little Getting, towards the end of the poem. Our pastor, Gordon Hugenberger, at the time, this was before he came to Park Street, drove up the driveway the following day. The house was, gutted by the flames, and so therefore was almost entirely gutted by the flames, and the structure was so compromised they had to be torn down. And he drove up the driveway. This is just before the wrecking crews came. He got out of his car. Now, anybody that knows Gordon Hugenberger here? Nobody? Well, he used to be the senior minister of Park Street for 20 years, but before that he was our pastor. Gordon's an Old Testament professor at Gordon Conwell, and a brilliant exegete, and an incredible teacher. And so we sat under his teaching for years, but Gordon drove our driveway the day after the fire, got out of his car with tears streaming down his face, and came up to me and said, "To be redeemed from fire, by fire." He quoted T.S. Eliot instead of the Bible. I was like, what? But there is, at the heart of reality, folks, a fire. It's a redeeming fire. It's a refiner's fire. It's the fire of divine love. And it burns everything away that stands between you and God. It will burn away anything that stands between you and God. So that's why as Christians we ought to hold most things lightly, right? Because we don't want to be like in the way of that fire. George MacDonald, the inspiration behind Tolkien and Lewis and Sayers and everybody, George MacDonald once said a really amazing thing. He said that the fire of divine love is unlike its earthly counterpart in this, that the further you are from it, the hotter it burns. The fire of divine love is unlike its earthly counterpart in this, that the further you go from it, the hotter it burns. So the thing to do with that fire, that choice of pyre or pyre, you want to choose the right pyre, the refiner's fire, because you move closer to that fire, all it does is warm you and bless you, and it burns everything away from you that is holding you down, everything that's just wrong, that's standing between you and complete forgiveness and complete and utter redemption. So it's a fire, but it's a dramatic. Let's face it, the dove descending breaks the air with flame of incandescent terror. Well, some strange things happened when that fire hit our house. And it really was a redeeming fire. It was also a destroying fire, but it destroyed 30 years of my art. And here's the wonderful and weird fact of that fire. There was a bunch of weird stuff that happened. One of them was that the day before the fire, an art collector had asked me to pull out from my storage racks all of my Golgotha paintings that hadn't been sold. And he wanted to see them. They were all Good Friday paintings. And I hadn't done, that was like, at that point, I had done them like 6 or 7 years earlier. So I pulled them all out and I laid them out in the studio against the big studio wall that's like 14 feet tall. And the following morning, we were struck by lightning and the house burned. And all of the work that was in my storage racks, which were the driest part of the basement, which was near the furnace, were incinerated. The only work of mine that survived the fire were the Golgotha paintings, the Good Friday paintings. And even those, the firemen, when they entered the house from my studio, because my studio had a firewall. That big 14-foot wall was a firewall. But it was there to protect the house from the studio, not the reverse. But it worked in reverse. Because, I'm working with solvents and stuff like that, and, combustible materials. So that's why you have a firewall in a studio. But anyway, that was one of the things that happened, was that all of the Good Friday paintings survived. So my work was tested by fire. We know it's going to happen, right? From 1 Corinthians chapter 3. Our work was tested by fire and apparently mostly found wanting. Hey, easy come, easy go. I mean, Meg, someone asked Meg, they said, Meg, that must have been really hard for you guys to lose all Bruce's art. She said, oh no, that was the unsold inventory. I still got the paint, Easy come, easy go. I mean, Meg, someone asked Meg, they said, Meg, that must have been really hard for you guys to lose all Bruce's art. She said, oh no, that was the unsold inventory. I still got the painter. Anyway, so this is another weird thing that happened. There was a part of the house that you could, if you went up on a ladder onto the roof, you could climb through a window, and you could actually, the floors weren't burned away. So it was where my library was, and a handful of other things. And behind a painting on the wall, which was cooked, was this image. Is there a way to dim the lights? Can we just turn off the lights?
Try to remember which ones are on. All of
Just
them.
all-
turn them
just
all
turn
down.
them all
Just
off.
turn them all off.
We have light from the windows anyway.
Second look. Yeah.
There. So this is what I found behind that painting on the wall. So picture this. Every wall in the house was jet black. Because it was a fuel fire. It had plumes of thick, sooty, horrible smoke that coated absolutely everything. Everything was like painted with flat black. But behind this painting on the wall, which the air must have worked back and forth, the hot air from the flames, created this image. I don't know what you see, but I see a horizon line with a road and a hand coming up out of the flames, pointing up towards heaven. It's just one of the many weird things that happened in our fire. So I photographed it. I brought a camera with me to go inside because I'd been up earlier the day following the fire, and I'd seen everything coated with black. And as an artist, I was just intrigued. You can't help yourself, even if it's your own house. It's just kind of cool. So I was photographing stuff, and then I came around the corner to my library. Every book cooked. New definition of cooking the books, right? You could not read a single spine of those books except this one. Okay, so I had my friend. We had a power cord going down to my neighbor's house, and he had a kind of Klieg light, and I clicked. And I went over to touch, and it just turned to dust. Oh. It was being held some kind of surface tension. I don't know what the scientific explanation is, but so that I could see it and photograph it. The minute I touched it, it just turned to dust, ashes. Wow. So, the writer of Ecclesiastes, besides saying, Hebel, everything is Hebel, it's just a mere breath or vapor, or what is another word, translation, vanity. Vanity of vanities, it's all vanity. He also says, of the making of books, there is no end. Well, there is an end to books. And there was the end to my house. But, I took this photo, or I had Meg take this photograph so I could look at the chimney, because we preserved the fireplace. Fireplaces are made for fire, so they survive fires. And so we cleaned it, with power washer and industrial degreasers. So the fireplace was intact, and we built the new house around the fireplace. And here's the house today, rebuilt. And here are some of the occupants. We have a cat named Catzilla. He's the black and white one, and he basically controls the entire farm. He's in charge. And no one has any question about that. And the other cat is Luna, and she calls him out now and then, but mostly Godzilla's in charge. So I thought for the second part of our time together today, I want to talk a little more about that hint half guest incarnation. And I want to talk a bit about process, artistic process, this making, breaking, remaking. For me, that's a very vigorous losing and finding of the form, the making of a painting. And it's all about, like we were talking about first this morning, about a certain kind of integrity of purpose that allows you to be willing to let go of a less good solution in search of an excellent or more complete solution to whatever it is you're after. For me, that takes the form of vigorous overpainting and scraping out and sanding down and layering and layering and layering, almost like excavating the image. I'll say more about that in a moment, but I'm going to talk about process. But I want to start with this quote from Flannery O'Connor. I often ask myself, what makes a story work? What makes it hold up? It must be a gesture that transcends any neat allegory, any pat moral categories a reader could make. It must be a gesture which somehow makes contact with mystery. I'm just going to read that again. It's so rich. I often ask myself, what makes a story work? What makes it hold up? It must be a gesture that transcends any neat allegory or pat moral categories that a reader could make. It must be a gesture which somehow makes contact with mystery. So, I mean, there's different ways of unpacking that. The one thing that I want to dive into comes back to what Gain Anaker was saying earlier, and that is you can't have as your priority some message if you're a novelist or a poet or a painter or a composer. You can't set about moralizing to your audience or trying to make a propositional argument through your work. There's a place for moralizing and there's a place for propositional rhetoric, but it's not art. That's propaganda. And there's nothing wrong with propaganda. I mean, it's often a pejorative term, but it doesn't have to be. Propaganda is just basically persuasive speech, right? But, advertising art is propaganda. We know that. You're selling soap or whatever, But art has to be, we were talking about this earlier, Colin was asking about how do you tease apart the business of skill and knowledge on the one hand and art on the other. And this is, I think O'Connor is onto something here. What she's saying is it has to touch on mystery. It has to connect, make contact with things that are much bigger than the immediate thing at hand. And I think that's actually true of everything in creation. I mean, I think the way the Lord has created the cosmos, anything you're willing to give your attention to will open up to you and disclose something about the one who made it. So here's a little story from my childhood. This is where I first discovered my vocation as an artist. I'm 5 years old. I'm in the backyard. It's springtime. Our backyard was magically overnight covered with hundreds, maybe thousands of little perfect white spheres. And I pick one up and I look at it, and it's actually, that sphere is made up of thousands of little threads, little gossamer threads that are coming out and at exactly the right length to create a globe. And what they're emanating from is another globe on the inside, a little round spherical form. And I breathed on it and it exploded and started floating away, the little seeds. The most common flower of all, a dandelion. And I burst into tears. But not because when I breathed on it that it disappeared. I burst into tears because I had the thought, God loves spheres. because I was 5 years old, and I'd just been reading about the planets and the stars, the sun, the earth. They're all spherical. And in my little kid's brain, I saw, God loves spheres. And I just, with an overflow of emotion, I started crying. I wasn't sad, I was joyful. You know, the body has a very limited vocabulary. It reacts the same way to sorrow as it does to joy. Mystery. It's this magnificent, open-ended, it's almost as though everything God has made is a doorway into God's presence, if you're paying attention. So, process. I'm just going to touch quickly on a couple of big principles. We can talk about them if we want to. We can move on to other things. I want to make a distinction between encounter and experience. So an experience is something you can possess. It's like a thing. People collect experiences nowadays the way people used to collect antiques. People aren't that interested in antiques anymore. They're interested in experiences. And the more exotic, the better. Especially if you can share them on social media and get lots of likes, right? What's the difference between that and an encounter? I can respond to that question, but I'm just going to ask you, what's the difference between an experience, something you can have, and an encounter? Anna?
Just from the hip, I would
Yeah.
say encounter feels like something that happens to you, that you receive. You're not like the primary actor.
Okay. Yeah. There's something reciprocal going on. Colin?
I was just going to say experience seems consumeristic to a certain extent, whereas an encounter seems relational.
Yes. Yes. Anyone
I would
else?
say the role of chance, I think, I see it more in an encounter.
Yeah. Is there any chance at all? You know, I mean, that's interesting. Yeah. But I agree. There is something outside of our control in the encounter. We enter into relationship. You can't control another person. You can try to, and they'll pretend that you have controlled them, but in their inner self, they can resist you. So there's something in the encounter that's personal, it's relational, it's transcendent. It touches on mystery. But it's the mystery of being, not just objects that can be experienced or possessed. All right, we'll come back to that. So that led into this basic principle about process, and that is letting down your guard, being unguarded, being willing to not be the one in the driver's seat. Just as in that relational encounter, you are no longer the one in control. You've entered into mystery. But in my experience as a painter, the only way that happens is if I'm willing to be broken. And the thing that I'm making sometimes has to be broken for there to be this transcendent encounter. And then kind of putting a fine point on that, in order to enter into relationship with the subject of the work and be a true servant of the work, you have to be willing to lose, you have to be willing to lose the image or lose the work. And I think there's a deep spiritual principle here that Jesus refers to when he says, if you seek to preserve your life, you're going to lose it. Mm-hmm. But if you lose your life, for my sake, you'll gain it unto eternal life. There's a deep principle of creativity at the heart of the creation. God himself, by creating, Jürgen Moltmann, I don't know if you would agree with this, but Jürgen Moltmann says that the act of creation itself was a form of kenosis, a form of self-emptying that our Creator God entered into. It wasn't just on the cross that kenosis took place, that self-emptying. It was in the very act of making. Because if there's something more than God, something other than God, God is diminished in some figurative sense, even though not literally diminished, but God loses something in order to gain the relationship. God was willing to lose. He was willing to lay down his life for his friends, and we are called his friends. So I'm gonna just walk you through one image out of many hundreds of paintings that I've made. It's fairly recent. It's been in the last decade, and it's from a collaboration that I did with another painter and a composer. Maybe you've heard of Mako Fujimura. He's a Japanese artist, a dear friend, and we collaborated on this project together with Chris Theophanidis, a composer, and a theologian by the name of Jeremy Begbie. And the four of us collaborated on this project in response to T.S. Eliot's 4 quartets. So the first painting that I did, I decided to approach the 4 quartets from the standpoint of the 4 classical elements of earth, air, fire, and water. And those are implicit in Eliot's poem. But also the 4 stages of life, childhood, youth, adulthood, and old age. Spring, summer, fall, and winter. The 4-ness of Eliot's 4 quartets, but also of our life together, intrigued me, and I wanted to go for it. So I started with spring, and I started with my grandchildren. At the time, I had only 4. We now have 5 grandchildren. And I started with this image of a tree, and you can see the very first layer of the painting. And the painting is about 8.5 feet tall by about almost 5 feet wide. And I started these portraits of my 4 grandchildren, began to develop them a little further, laying in layers of color and silver and gold leaf. And I got them to a pretty high level of verisimilitude, to use a fancy term, naturalistic kind of presence. And then I began to question the painting. And it's this whole question of what is the image moving towards? What does it need to become? What is it? I don't have any other better way of saying this, but what does the painting want to be? And so I began to erase, or literally put leaves of gold and silver over top of the children, and they began to essentially disappear, except for one. And then it became clear to me that's what the painting wanted to become, was this one child, my grandson Will, sitting in the tree. Here's a close-up. And in order to communicate where this comes from in the poem, I have to recite the poem, a part of the poem. And in order to recite the poem, I've got to stand up. It's just because it sort of requires this physical embodiment, right? So this is how it goes. It's the very end of the entire 4 quartets. It's the last stanza. And you'll see where this painting comes from. It goes like this. With the drawing of this love and the voice of this calling, we shall not cease from exploration. And the end of all our exploring will be to arrive where we started and know the place for the first time. Through the unknown, remembered gate. When the last of earth left to discover is that which was the beginning, at the source of the longest river, the voice of the hidden waterfall, and the children in the apple tree. Not known because not looked for, but heard. Half heard in the stillness between 2 waves of the sea. Quick, now, here, now, always. A condition of complete simplicity, costing not less than everything. And all shall be well, and all manner of things shall be well, when the tongues of flame are enfolded in the crowned knot of fire, and the fire and the rose are one. It's just so much imagery there. But just a couple of quick touchdown points in the poem. So to arrive where we started and know the place for the first time. That sense of completion, of return, and also, in a sense, to a second innocence, to arrive at the place we started through the unknown, remembered gate. When the last of earth left to discover is that which was the beginning, at the source of the longest river, the voice of the hidden waterfall, and the children in the apple tree, not seen, not known because not looked for, but heard. So, what Eliot is talking about here, and he quotes Julian of Norwich, all shall be well, and all manner of things shall be well, and then he adds, where the tongues of flame are enfolded in a crowned knot of fire, and the fire and the rose are one. The fire is the fire of divine love, the fire of God that we were just talking about. And the rose, by the way, the medieval symbol of the church and of the Virgin Mary is the rose, the multifoliate rose of Dante. And the Virgin Mary, in that tradition, is understood as a symbol of the church. She's the first disciple, and she's also the mother, and she's the one who welcomes us all. And so we are the church. We are that mother. We are that multifoliate rose. And when the fire and the rose are one, that's when things are completed. So Eliot, four quartets, I recommend to read it aloud if you haven't read it, or if you've read it and you didn't comprehend it, which is about most of us. Read it aloud. It's musical. And that's why I had to recite it for you, because it has to be embodied. Okay, so that's the end of my first part here. So we can stop there. I've got two more short sections. Well, let's just start there,
A little more light, if somebody could turn on a little bit more light there. Questions, comments? Yes, Kyle.
I'm just curious about your process of making the painting, because there's so much that you put into it that isn't going to be seen in the final piece, because I would have never had any idea that there's more than just a boy there. And so, is there any reason for that other than it's just that's how the painting develops? Or it's just interesting, because if you hadn't told us that, we wouldn't know.
So the process, you wouldn't normally, we wouldn't know that there are children underneath what you've layered there, if you had not told us. Any observations about that process and anything? Is that it?
Yeah, I just realized, wow, there's so much. You explaining how the painting developed is as much a part of its meaning as the final image.
What you've explained adds to the meaning that we would not have known if you had not explained it, and so.
What's your name?
Kyle.
Hi, Kyle. I honestly believe that artists are not the best interpreters of their work, and yet I'll take a crack at saying a couple things about this. I think that the children that are invisible to you are still there. And I don't think I consciously, I know that text, the children in apple tree not known because not looked for, but heard, half heard in the stillness between two waves of the sea. He's basically saying, and at the beginning, that's at the very end of the poem, at the very first of the four quartets, at the beginning, there are children in the garden, hidden, excitedly, full of laughter. And so there's a sense of these invisible children throughout the poem. They're still in the painting, literally, physically still there. So I don't know what that means, but it certainly generates something in the painting it's a presence. The painting had to become what it became. There's a certain inevitability to a work of art, and the artist, after you're done, the artist is as much a viewer or listener as the audience. There's a great story about this. The playwright Arthur Miller, who wrote Death of a Salesman, when it was first performed, he was invited to the premiere performance. He was sitting in the front row, and they put on the play, and afterwards they asked him, "So what did you think?" And what Miller said was, "I had no idea I'd written that." So, and he was just being honest. He wasn't trying to be clever. I think that's true for artists and composers and playwrights and poets. They're vessels for something. So I don't really know. Maybe, Kyle, if you came to my studio and you saw this painting, you could probably do a better job of telling me what it's about. I know that text got under my skin. You know, that text that I recited for you, and it helped generate this and several other images. But beyond that, I'd probably have to sit down and be like you. Just look at it carefully and see what I encounter. Yeah.
I'm curious about the meaning, because it seems like we can appreciate this with the poem in a way that gives us meaning that we might not see, like, because you're the artist and sort of that thing, but we wouldn't get all of that if we didn't have this original source and poem. And so I guess I'm curious, at what point is the audience mistaken because they're coming from a different starting point? So how do we know when the audience is seeing something that's really there that the artist doesn't see, and when do we need the artist to step in and be like, no, it's not about this poem, it's about this poem?
Did you notice in that little film they filmed me as I was saying, I think it's a terrible idea for the artists to go around telling people what their work is about. I really mean that. I think artists really are not the authority on their own work. So it can mean a lot of different things. I really think that genuine works of art are multivalent. They mean in multiple directions, unlike propositional rhetoric, which is meant to be a logical progression, and it really only means one thing. But a poem, even though a poem uses words, it breaks those words open so that they spill meaning in all different kinds of directions. So it's not one, there isn't just one meaning. And also another aspect of art, and by art I mean music, poetry, painting, etc. Another aspect of art that's thrilling to me is that it acquires meaning over time, long after the artist is dead. I mean, I've been in conversation with Rembrandt most of my life, but he's been dead 500 years. I'm in conversation with Piero della Francesca, who's been dead for 800 years, almost. The great thing about art is being dead is not a disqualification for being part of the conversation. Art gathers to itself multivalent meanings. At its best, it really is a manifestation of the Spirit of God. At its worst, it could be the manifestation of a spirit of evil spirits. Let's face it. You know, there's lots of other spirits that want to get a voice. That's a whole other conversation. But yeah.
Yes, Colin.
I'm interested in art critique, because we were talking of art as an encounter, something relational that has meaning in many different directions. And it seems almost like it's a second personal experience, me and this work of art, almost as a living and breathing thing that I'm encountering. And I wonder how we can then think of analyzing art or critiquing art, because that seems inherently third personal, and is also removing some of the core mystery of the artwork. Is that true, or how should we think of art critique?
Has anyone here read the book Experiment and Criticism by C.S. Lewis? Highly recommended. It's one of his more scholarly works, Experiment and Criticism. Lewis does a marvelous job of explaining what the role of the genuine critic is. Yes, analysis does come into it, but it's not all there is. A really good critic is like an exegete, basically removing obstacles so that the viewer can encounter the work, so the listener can encounter the music. It doesn't diminish it at all. It actually makes it possible. A really good critic, we need really good critics who have done their work and sacrificially done their work so that other people can encounter the work. Because there are obstacles, let's face it. The main obstacle is our own ignorance, but it's also prejudice. I mean, here's a funny story. This will show you what nut job I was. I assumed that Mark Rothko, everyone know who Mark Rothko is? Color field painter? Maybe you don't know. Mark Rothko is kind of the prototypical abstract expressionist color field painter. His paintings are nothing but fields of diaphanous color. There's no image. There's nothing represented there. There's hardly even a shape. There's almost no texture. They're just fields of color. He didn't always paint like that, but he arrived at that place, and he gave it his life work. Basically, Mark Rothko's life work is color field painting. And he kind of set in motion a whole new genre of art. But when I was in art school, I was totally skeptical of Mark Rothko. I said, kind of like most people say, my kid brother could do that kind of thing. But I was totally skeptical. And I won the exhibition prize, the MFA exhibition prize at BU that year, which was a year abroad, all expenses paid. And of course, I was already married, had 2 kids at that point, so it didn't quite last a year. We had to, sell a lot of stuff at a yard sale to try to make extra money so we could stay there longer. But one of my experiences was being able to go to the Tate Museum in London, and I was just enjoying the beautiful landscape paintings and the portrait paintings and whatnot. And I saw this sign that said, Mark Rothko Gallery. So there's a whole gallery devoted to Mark Rothko in the Tate Museum in London. This is not the Tate Modern. This is the traditional Tate Museum. I was kind of mystified. So I walk into this gallery, and it's just surrounded with Mark Rothko's paintings, and I burst into tears and was sobbing. I could not control myself. That's what the paintings did to me. I was totally unprepared. And then I read the titles, and they were things like The Ninth Hour. They were about the crucifixion. This whole room of paintings were basic. He was not a Christian, but he was drawn to, there's a whole chapel of his paintings down in Houston, the Demunil Chapel. They're 20-foot tall paintings in that case, and they're all very dark, but they're also about Good Friday. But I was just crying uncontrollably, and I was looking around, I was embarrassed because I was like undone by these paintings. So I don't know how I got off on that, except to say that I think that there's a lot there that is nonverbal. It's embedded in the work. Rothko is a very deeply melancholy person. He is able to communicate that through paint, through color. Incredible.
One of the impressions that I have, and I'm not an artist, but we've talked about this intersubjectivity and the objectivity of art, and it seems to me that it's not appreciated often by people who say, my kid brother could do this. It's not appreciated that there's judging going on in the other direction as well. The really great art judges the observer to a certain extent, in the sense that if you're not able to see it and appreciate it, then it's not the great work of art that's defective in this equation. Would you agree? Would you say?
Well, I do think what I was trying to say, Colin, was that it takes some work on our part to clear away the obstacles, to be receptive, and to enter into relationship with the work of art. But the role of a good critic is to basically clear some of those obstacles for us. But I think you're right. I don't think just because you have a negative reaction to a work of art that it's necessarily a defect in you. And it may not even be a defect in the work of art. It may be that you need to do a little bit of work to clear away some of the obstacles for yourself to encounter that work. It also might be not very good. And that's a tough one, I thought Mark Rothko's work was dumb until I had a first-hand encounter with it. Unguarded and undone by it, Maybe one or two more, and then we'll go to the next section. Yeah.
I was just going to add real quickly. You've already danced around it. It's a dialogue. You have to let the art speak. You have to wait for it.
Yeah.
There is a dialogue going on. So part of being challenged by the art and being undone by the art is you have to be willing to enter into that space and let the art
Let it do its work.
catch you.
Yeah.
And so your experience at the Tate was you were caught off guard. You walked in and it hit you in a way that you had never experienced. You were already knew something, but there was now the art was speaking to you.
Yeah, I wonder, I mean, I didn't think about this until just now. I wonder why I was receptive all of a sudden. I mean, I was traveling alone. Meg and the kids were back in Italy. I had gone to London on my own. A lot of my familiar support system was gone. I suddenly was vulnerable.
Yes.
And unexpected, totally unexpected. The spirit just opened up for me then. Another thought just occurred to me that I wanted to share before I go into this next section, and that is, not only is a good critic indispensable, but a good host for the art, like a gallerist or a curator. I know Rosemary, who's sitting in the corner there, has opened her home to artists and made her home into a gallery. It's an incredible experience to go into someone's home and to encounter the work in a warm, hospitable atmosphere, because then a lot of the obstacles are taken away. Some of those obstacles in institutional galleries, the museums are, I have to be very careful here. But in Rosemary's house, you're there usually to have a meal, hang out, enjoy good company, maybe pray, and you can encounter the work in a friendly, hospitable atmosphere. Hospitality is hugely important when it comes to encountering the work of art. It can't be overestimated. It's hugely important. So let's move forward. We can come back to this. Next thing I want to do is just walk you through another work that I was made. This was a commission. I was offered an artist in residency at Duke University some years ago. Now, 7 years ago. And I was commissioned to do a large work for them. And so I'll let you see this, and maybe we can kill the lights for this.
Well, I begin a project with drawings, many layers. We build up dozens of layers and then sometimes drastically edit in order to arrive at the image that seems to want to come into being, even at the expense of getting rid of months of work. Then I'll cut through wet paint to underlayers to try to reveal palimpsests of what was there before. It can be pretty brutal, almost unmaking the very thing I've been making.
So, I don't know if you got a chance to read the bit. I got a phone call 4 months into this project. We can't accommodate that piece as we originally thought. There's going to be a change of plans, and they said, we're very sorry. We're going to pay you the same amount of money, but it has to be a third of that size. And I elected to not just simply start over again, but actually to use what I had been doing, cut it into pieces, and then reconfigure it. And I thought I'd just quickly walk you through what the result was. So I changed the title from Resurrection to Riven Tree. The word riven means cut, you know. Like the trees that were riven by the lightning in our home, and literally the sap cooked on the insides and, you know, had to be torn down like the house. And there are essentially 5 panels. So there's the bottom panel, and there are 4 elements with this mysterious 5th, which I'll talk about in a second. Okay, so here's how it works. So the bottommost panel, the predella, is time before time. This is just me extemporizing with the symbolism here, but there's probably more to it than this, Colin. The roots of the tree, Eden, the fall of Adam, element earth. I love the fact that Adam's name means dirt, means earth, Adama. The central panels on the left and the right are the time of the cross. Horizontal, the broken grid, our time. The tree is split, is riven. It's redemption time, it's time between times, the cross as tree. From the tree of the knowledge of good and evil to the tree of the cross. Elements are fire and water. The topmost panel, the lunette, is future time. The grid is transfigured in gold, and the tree is a sprout, or almost like a fountain of water, but it's a little sprout, a little sprig. And the element is air, like the shoot that comes up out of the stump of Jesse, predicted in Isaiah. And then the final panel, surprisingly, is the middle, the thing that is cutting the tree in half, the riven, the thing that's actually making it a riven tree is time outside of time. Christ's resurrection and ascension, his divine intervention, kenosis, the descent of grace, the ascent of Christ, divine presence breaking through a lightning strike, sap rising in the new tree, and the element is the 5th element. In the medieval mind, the entire universe was made up of 4 elements, earth, air, fire, and water, but there was this mysterious quintessence, the 5th element. That's where we get the word quintessence. Literally the 5th essence. They called it the ether, not to be confused with the gas ether. But they had this idea that the 5th element held all the other 4 elements together in the entire cosmos. Guess who the 5th element is? Well, so this is the final project, and this is what it looked like finally installed at Duke. It seemed to fit. So I was pretty happy with that. Now I can stop here, and we can talk about this project, or I can finish up with another very brief bit, which I do. What do you think? Want to keep moving? Or you want to
keep moving? Stop. Questions? Who's got a question?
I have a question.
Yes.
Can you speak to your relationship between theology and art? Because it seems like it's not a direct one. It's not you're sitting down with scripture, okay, this means this thing, and this means this thing. But I also see like years of theology and discipleship in the art. What's that connection like?
Thank you. Yeah, I mean, you said it. You answered your own question. The truth is, I kind of think of myself as like a tea bag. I'm steeping in hot water for year after year after year. The steeping, the tea is made not by some direct shifting from the metaphor here. If I went to try to illustrate the theological reflections that I've had and read over the last 40 years, I would end up with some pretty awful looking paintings. They'd be horrible. No one would want to look at them. They'd be so busy, But but allowing it to percolate, there's that metaphor coming back, although it's coffee now. Letting those ideas and those theological themes kind of emerge naturally out of the mix of imagination and memory and intellect, relationship, dialogue, conversation. I really did learn a lot from my students over those 40 years of teaching. And they say if you want to learn something, teach it. It means you have to really study it, and that's what it was for me. I'll just finish up here. This will be short. So I thought I'd introduce you to one of the 20 paintings in the Ordinary Saints project that I do with Malcolm Geit and Jack Redford. Here's Malcolm.
The poem Sitting for Bruce consists of 3 sonnets. I'm going to give you their titles now, and then with the music we'll go through them in sequence. So they are Prepared, Abraded, and Finished. This flat wood, covered with its squares of gold, through which my blurred reflection comes and goes, will one day hold my image. It will hold the face I cannot see up to the world. For now, it keeps its secret. Only shows across its bright gold leaf some scars and flaws and one thin streak of red, an open wound from which, I'm told, my portrait will emerge. Till then, this waiting space will hold its charge, the strong potential of its golden ground. A light behind my back, before my mind. A blaze beneath the sill of what I am, that tells me I am always on the verge of something that I haven't yet become. Herman takes a sander to the gold to shape my likeness in the clay and dust. His hands are bleeding as he takes a hold of this abrasion, for he knows he must unmake the thing he's made to make it better. He opens out and flays the gold and clay, unveiling shapes and painting with the sander. I see my face half formed and look away. He takes me back to all that grinds me down, strips my defenses, leaving me exposed. I flinch back from the form he has disclosed, as though I had been opened to the bone. He's not finished. Now he paints through pain the subtle strokes that make me whole again. For I am incomplete. My mirrors show no more than flaws and fragments as they pass. The selves I lose that mock me as they go and leave me trembling by the darkened glass. I do not see the face that once I had, nor can I see the one I will become, flitting between a shadow and a shade. I was, I whisper, not I am. And then comes one who calls me from my ruin, as from this bricolage of dust and stain. He works to build what I have broken down, outfaces me, and finds my face again. Just as this artist summons me to see how grief and joy and time might finish me.
So that is one of 20 poems that Malcolm has written in response to the paintings. He was sitting in my studio that day, and I showed him that panel with a gold leaf, and there was one streak that totally mystified me because it would not take the gold leaf. I kept trying to put gold leaf on it, it would come off. It was just this gash. And the underlayment of gold leafing is called bole. It's gilder's clay. It's kind of this rusty red, like almost like dry blood. So he made that connection. But I literally had him sit. I took out a sander and began grinding away the gold leaf, and his face seemed to emerge, almost like one of those, like the Shroud of Turin, like a vestigial image instead of the beginning of an image. But then it just got clearer and clearer to me.
Quick question.
So, yes.
When you were showing the pieces of art, were those like just static photos, or was that like a video recording of the painting being shown?
Didn't hear that.
So when you the faces of the art, are these videos or are they photographs?
Yeah.
Which are?
The panels that we see right in front of us here.
Like
These are just photographs of the panel that I took while it was in process.
During the video too, though.
But also during the video, same thing?
Oh, I just used the photographs in the video. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, no, these photographs were taken over a period of weeks while different stages of the painting, and then I stitched them together in a video so that they could go with the poem and the music and so forth. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah.
In the first picture, I saw Malcolm X's
Me
face,
too.
but then it wasn't there, and I couldn't get it back. That was just a photo and a trick of my eyes.
Yeah.
Or what?
I
kept looking.
I'm just way too clever. I use Photoshop and InDesign and Final Cut Pro and all these digital technologies. You know what? This is my sketchbook. It literally is. I no longer use a physical sketchbook. I use Photoshop as my sketchbook. Because it's so much easier for clients when I do a commission for them to, like you saw that big painting. It looked like it really was in that space. It wasn't. Uh-huh. It was just Photoshopped in. Yeah. Yeah.
I have a question about your process. Two questions. One is, how did it change before and after the fire? And then the second question is, how does your process of asking questions when you make art change when you collaborate versus when you're doing it?
So Vivian is asking 2 questions about your process. How did your process change before and after the fire?
Maybe for the audience too.
How did your process change before and after the fire? And how does your process change when you're working solo versus in collaboration?
Well, so first, I didn't know this. It was one of my students that pointed out to me that my work after our house fire, you asked about the fire, right? A student pointed out to me that the color choices that I was making, my palette, after the fire was drastically different than my paintings before the fire. That was not a conscious decision.
How so?
Well, they were, before the fire, all of my work was dominated by blues and greens and lavenders and purples and stuff. And after the fire, they were dominated by oranges and reds and browns. Fiery kind of colors. So that was one thing that I wasn't aware of until someone pointed it out to me. I think the fire just liberated me from any kind of sense that I had to be consistent or I had to somehow, I mean, literally, my trail vanished. My footprints in the sand were gone because that work was eliminated. So I was free to reinvent what it was I was doing. The whole body of work that I did immediately after the fire is called Building in Ruins. I don't think that's on my website anymore. My previous website had that, but it's in a number of books. But I did probably 20 different paintings that were in that series called Building in Ruins, and I understood the word building as both a verb and a noun, right? But they show scaffolding, and they show things falling apart, and human figures that seem to be coming apart, or subtly dissolving. Like one of them was Elegy for Bonhoeffer, and behind him looks like a Nazi death camp that's just crumbling. And his figures in the foreground kind of dip upside down, dipping into a pool of gold. I know it sounds bizarre, but you can actually Google that, Bruce Herman, Elegy for Bonhoeffer, you can see the image. There were a lot of changes. And then in terms of collaboration, I think when I collaborate with other artists, especially with people outside of art, like poets and composers, I feel like it takes me to a dimension of my own work that I was unable to do. I mean, Malcolm said it perfectly. He said that all three of us, he stated exactly what all three of us were experiencing with this project, which is that it's like that old cliche, the whole is greater than the sum of the parts. There's this something else that came into being that none of the three of us really could author, but it was only because we were working together that it came into being, and it's like what you just witnessed. But there are a few people here who have been part of that Ordinary Saints experience or encounter where you have the paintings, the music, the live music, and the poet reciting. It's really extraordinary. It's like a worship service. Is what it felt like. Anything else? No questions? By the way, am I speaking too loudly? Because I can't modulate my own voice. I'm okay? All right. Thank you.
Bruce, can you trace where that line was in these, on a more finished panel?
The red gash. Where is the red gash on the finished work here?
Let me back up. See if I can find it. No, that's going forward. Here we go. I think it's right straight through Malcolm.
It's not. You're not projecting here.
Oh, sorry. Yeah, let's see. It would be. I think it kind of goes right through, starting where that skull is, which sort of painted itself. By the way, I sort of discovered that skull. It wasn't intentional. Going right through him, and the skull is kind of like in traditional Vanitas paintings, this memento mori. Remember death. Remember that thou art dust, and unto dust shalt thou return. Kind of a Ash Wednesday, Lenten, like the season we're in right now.
But just for the record, Bruce, I was almost in tears in that video. That was so precious.
Sorry, I didn't.
The video was very emotional. He was almost in tears watching the video of the process of this composition.
Thank you. Yeah, it was wonderful to be there. And Gain and Scott were there at the very first event with the Ordinary Saints, and with
Scott saw it in Texas. Yeah.
Oh, you were in Texas, yeah.
I saw it in Oxford.
You were right. Okay.
One question that I had: you retain the squarishness of the gold leaf. Almost, all of your works. Is there something more to say about that?
There is. I think, Kelly, if I told you my trade secrets, I'd have to kill you. No, I'm just kidding. No, seriously. Silverleaf and gold leaf comes in perfect little squares, right? And one of the things I discovered is when I lay them down, they naturally form a grid, which is perfect because one of the things that I'm very interested in at an image level, quite apart from the process and the physical materials, is the interplay between the grid and the dissolution of the grid. The losing and finding of order, or it's kind of a little bit like the difference between scripted and unscripted, written and extemporaneous, improvisatory versus highly structured. Both are necessary. And I'm really interested in the interplay between, it's like the children that were there and not there. And one art historian wrote about that painting that I showed you from the Quartets series, a young guy named Matthew Milliner. Read his books, he's an incredible writer. But he wrote a piece about that, and he said he felt like the grid, the squares were like a cell signal breaking up and coming back in. Can you hear me? Can you hear me now? Can you hear me now? I thought that was a really interesting analog for the digital reality there. The grid comes and goes in my paintings. And I think for me personally, I don't know what a more astute interpretation might be, but my own gut level understanding of it is it's a bit like time. Time has this tick-tock element, but it also has another element where time seems to speed up and slow down, it even seems to stop. Our own traveling through time is not as regular as tick-tock, tick-tock, even though our heart is beating like that. Da-da, da is iambic pentameter, right? The heartbeat. Da-da, 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 da-da. But there's this other element where our heart skips a beat and we are surprised by something. And time does that. I think Lewis captured that beautifully in the Narnia stories, where 1,000 years can go by in a single day, and then years can go by and only a day has happened, So for me, that grid becomes like the tick-tock, the regularity of time, but then the fact that it breaks up and dissolves and gets painted over and scraped out and painted into is more like narrative time, which is, more mysterious. That probably was incoherent. I'm thinking out loud here.
It also reminds me of what you said to Connor about architecture and a move to grid-like sharp lines.
Right.
And a move away from organic shapes. I feel like all of your paintings include both.
They're both. Yeah, I love paradox because it's truer than flat-out logical statements about reality. Reality is weird.
Yeah.
I mean, truth is much stranger than fiction. People, when we write stories, they have a beginning, a middle, and an end. I'm not so sure about the story that God is writing. The end seems to be the beginning. I mean, I think that's part of what Eliot was getting at. He says the end of all our exploring will be to arrive where we started and know the place for the first time. And I think other people said, I think it was Mary Queen of Scots when she was about to be beheaded said, "In my end is my beginning." So there is that sense in which divine time is not our time. It's much stranger, much more wonderful. Well, I think we're good. Maybe
I want to ask one more question.
Sure.
I think applies to a lot of people here that we talked about briefly and that is art as livelihood and art as avocation. There's a lot of people who are not able to make their livelihood. You've made your livelihood through teaching art, which is not the same thing as art, but is very close. What would you say to those people who are maybe struggling with the fact that they are not able to make a livelihood through their art, but also feel a strong calling to it?
Well, you know what? I'm going to sound like a wise guy here, Kelly, but I think that's a conversation for another time.
Okay. All right.
But it's a serious question. I think I'll say one brief word about that, and that is I really believe that God pays for what he orders. When the scriptures say God will provide, I believe that that's literally true. So if God has called you to something, as long as you step up to the plate, God will make it possible for you to do it. It may not be easy. It may, in fact, be the hardest thing of all. to do what it is that God asks you to do. I mean, there's our Lord in the Garden of Gethsemane. Could I just not do this one bit? But thy will be done. So I think, and like Meg saying to our friend Elsha, what makes you think God should pay you to do the thing he wants you to do? So it may not be easy, but I think God will provide. I don't want to be glib about that because I know how real the struggle is for young artists trying to make a living. I had a wise professor in art college say to me, Bruce, you may have to do some other kind of work to support your habit. I didn't know I was going to become a professor. That was the last thing on my mind when I was in art college. But it worked out well because I found myself stimulated by my students. You know, it didn't drain my energy from my art. It just gave me an extra dimension to it. You know, so. But I think that could be true of almost any job you do if you do it with all your heart and trust God. But I did say to, I think she left, but Vera asked me at the lunch break, she said, how have you worked out this thing between making a living and making art if your art doesn't sell or what it is you feel prompted to make as art doesn't necessarily have a lot of commercial value at the moment? And I said to her what I'll end on that note, and that is I said, you know, just remember, God will provide. You're not going to find time to do this. You've got to make time. You're not going to find space to do it. You've got to make space. Don't be passive. If you feel a sense of calling, you need to make space. You need to make time for it. Period. No matter what you have to do. I worked in a fish packing factory for 2 years. I drove a taxi cab for a couple of years. Worked as a short order cook. I built houses. I did all kinds of crazy stuff. All the while I was painting. And not only that, but I founded an art department at Gordon College and an art gallery. And by God's grace, I kept painting. Yeah. I think we're going to end with prayer.
Yes, if you would bring up that collect on here. We usually pray for the person who's been speaking to us and try to bless them in return for the gifts that they've brought to us. I want us to begin just with a minute. If you would look at that prayer and pray that prayer silently, and then I will speak it aloud in a minute. O God, whom saints and angels delight to worship in heaven, be ever present with your servants, and Bruce especially, who seek through art and music to perfect the praises of your people on earth. And grant them, even now, glimpses of your beauty, and make them worthy at length to behold it unveiled forevermore. Through Jesus Christ our Lord. Amen. Thanks for coming. Shall we express our thanks to this?